Welcome to Fanko Decodes. I am Fanko. It was inevitable, perhaps, that the scent of bitter almonds would always remind him of the fate of unrequited love. But on this particular Pentecost Sunday, the scent was not of almonds, but of mangoes, wet earth, and the metallic tang of an impending storm. It was the afternoon that Dr. Juvenal Urbino, the city's most distinguished physician, the guardian of its public health, the man who was revered almost as a saint, died in a manner so absurd, so stripped of dignity, that it felt like a cosmic joke. He did not die fighting the cholera plague he had spent a lifetime eradicating. He did not die in his sleep, surrounded by weeping grandchildren. He died falling from a mango tree, trying to catch a parrot. That evening, as the news rippled through the city, his wife, Fermina Daza, did something that shocked the household staff and would have scandalized the social elite had they seen it. She did not collapse in a faint. She did not wail. Instead, she sat in the cavernous, silent library of their colonial mansion. She gathered her husband's belongings, his pristine linen suits, his medals of honor, the artifacts of his illustrious career, and she fed them, one by one, into the fireplace. As the flames licked at the fabric, turning the symbols of a perfect marriage into gray ash, she whispered a question into the void, a question that had been clawing at her throat for half a century. Who is the master of this house? Is it the husband who just died? Or is it me, the one left behind? Only when the last button had melted and the last cufflink was blackened did she exhale a long, shuddering breath that seemed to expel 50 years of accumulated dust. Now, she said to the empty room, now, finally, this place looks like I always dreamed it would. A spacious, free home. That belongs only to me. Before we descend further into this story, I want to ask you listening in the quiet of your room or on your commute home, a question. It is a question that gnaws at the foundation of modern intimacy. Imagine you are back at that critical age, the precipice where youth ends and adulthood demands its due. Standing before you is a suitor who is, by every metric of the NASDAQ or the social register, perfect. He comes from old money. He is talented. He has the manners of a prince. He offers you a life where you will never have to look at a price tag, never have to worry about the future. He has only one flaw. You do not love him. There is no spark, no electricity. In fact, his very perfection repels you slightly. He is too clean, too sterile. What do? Do you listen to the chorus of society, the pragmatic whispers of your parents saying, love is a habit. It can be learned after the wedding? Do you treat marriage like a corporate merger, a strategic alliance for safety? Or do you hold on to that fragile, perhaps childish notion? I will not marry without passion? Do you choose the loved one and risk a life of instability? Or do you choose the right one and risk a life of hollow comfort? Over a century ago, a 21-year-old girl named Fermina Daza stood at this exact crossroads. Driven by the terrifying prospect of becoming a spinster, a social pariah, she chose the latter. She chose the gilded cage. She married the perfect doctor she did not love. And for 50 years, she demonstrated the terrifying price of that safety. Today, on Fanko Decodes, we are reopening the autopsy on Gabriel García Márquez's masterpiece, Love in the Time of Cholera. We are going to look past the romantic haze and confront the brutal truth we often ignore. When a marriage is founded on rational calculation rather than passion, how does it survive for half a century? Is marrying the nice guy a path to stability, or is it a form of slow-motion suicide? Are we the masters of our marriages, or are we simply legal prisoners? Prepare yourselves. Let's decode the truth. Chapter 1. When Death Rips Away the Mask. To understand the marriage of Dr. Urbino and Fermina, we cannot start with them. We must start with the body found earlier that same Sunday, the suicide of the photographer. It was this death that cracked the pristine veneer of the doctor's golden wedding anniversary. Jeremier de Saint-Amour was a refugee, a man washed ashore from the Antilles, a cripple who made his living taking portraits of children. In the rigid social hierarchy of this colonial city, he was nobody, if not for the fact that he and Dr. Urbino shared a fanatical obsession with chess. Jeremier would have remained an invisible man, a ghost in the machine of society. But this humble, physically broken man possessed something the great doctor did not. He possessed a love story so profound, so radical, that it shook the doctor to his core. Jeremier had a woman. She was a mixed-race woman of striking presence, no longer young, but carrying the heavy, ripe beauty of autumn. Their relationship was a complete anomaly. She was not his wife. She was not his live-in concubine. They were never seen walking together in the plazas. In a city where gossip travels faster than the cholera bacterium, where state secrets are discussed in the market, these two managed to hide their love for half a lifetime. It was only when the police arrived to collect his body that the truth spilled out. They had chosen a shadow love, no contracts, no joint bank accounts, no public performance of affection. Why? Because they lived by a code entirely their own. Jeremiah had decided long ago that he would not grant time the victory of decaying his dignity. He vowed that at age 60, the moment he felt his autonomy slipping, he would checkmate himself. He would end his life. And the woman? She accepted this. Think about the brutality of that acceptance. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that she respected his autonomy more than she needed his presence. The text gives us chilling details. She helped him prepare. She was there on his final night. She watched him write his testament. She played the final game of chess with him. And then, before he swallowed the gold cyanide salts, he sent her away. He wanted to protect her from the legal mess, from the inquiries of the police. When Dr. Urbino arrived at the scene, the air thick with the smell of developing chemicals and death, he found the letter. Following the instructions, he tracked the woman down to a dilapidated shack in the slums. The doctor, a man of rigid Catholic morality, a man who believed life was a sacred duty, was scandalized. He looked at this grieving woman and asked the question any civilized person would ask. You knew he was going to kill himself. Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you call me? Her answer was a sledgehammer to his worldview. I could not do that, she said, her voice steady, because I loved him too much. Let that sink in. I loved him too much to force him to live a life he no longer wanted. Dr. Urbino, who believed he had heard every confession, every lie, every plea in the city, was silenced. He had never heard a definition of love that required such devastating unselfishness. And then she delivered the final blow. She refused to attend the funeral. She refused to shed a tear in public. She told the doctor she would continue to love Jeremier in her memory, in the silence of her heart. And she had no need to perform a pantomime of grief for a society that never accepted them. This was love in its rawest form. Untamed, illegal, free, cruel. Contrast this with Dr. Urbino. He had just celebrated his golden wedding anniversary. 50 years of marital bliss. He and Fermina Daza were the city's idols. They were the standard bearers of decency. They couldn't survive a moment without each other. They were constantly in each other's orbit. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But Marquez, with the precision of a surgeon, cuts away the necrotic tissue to reveal the bone. Neither he nor she could say whether their mutual dependence was based on love or on habit. They had never asked themselves the question, because both preferred not to know the answer. They preferred not to know. They lived in terror of the answer. They lived in terror of realizing that what they had wasn't passion, but a mutual pity society. Looking at the corpse of the photographer, a man who died to preserve his dignity, Dr. Urbino felt a strange, cold sensation in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was envy. He envied the dead man. He envied the intensity. He envied the fact that the photographer had lived a life of authentic, burning choice, while he, the great doctor, had lived a life of scripted performance. The photographer's death was a mirror. On one side, the doctor saw his own life, bright, sterile, safe, and fundamentally boring. On the other side, he saw the darkness of the photographer's life, hidden, tragic, but blazing with a fire that Urbino had never felt in his 50 years of perfect marriage. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was merely a high-functioning actor in a play written by society. Chapter 2. The deadline of 21 now. Let us rewind the clock. Let's strip away the gray hair and the gold medals. Let's go back to the late 19th century. We find Fermina Daza in her bedroom, standing before a mirror. She is 20 years old. She is staring at her reflection, but she isn't admiring her famous haughty goddess beauty. She is counting the days. She is looking at her own face like a perishable good in a market stall. In that era, and let's be honest, in many circles even today the age of 21 was a cliff edge. It was the psychological expiration date. If you crossed that line without a ring on your finger, you are damaged goods. You became a spinster. You were the object of pity and whispers. Fermina had just done something incredibly brave. She had broken off her engagement to her first love, Florentino Ariza. Florentino was a poor poet, a man of shadows and violins, a man who wrote letters that burned with romantic fever. But when Fermina finally saw him in the harsh light of reality, she realized she had been in love with a phantom. She realized his love was a projection, a fantasy that couldn't survive the weight of the real world. So she cut him loose. She chose reality over delusion. But here is the tragedy. Discarding the wrong person does not guarantee you will find the right one. Enter Dr. Juvenal Urbino. He was 28, the golden bachelor. He had studied in Paris. He brought back new medicines, new ideas, and the latest European dances. He played Mozart on the piano. His family crest was carved into the stone of the city's history. His resume was flawless. He was the Elon Musk of his dating pool visionary, wealthy, powerful. But Fermina? She felt nothing. Actually, that's not true. She felt annoyance. She disliked his confidence. She resented how much her father wanted the match. To her, Urbino wasn't a lover. He was a symbol of the authority she wanted to rebel against. But the clock was ticking. Tick, tock. 21 was approaching like a storm front. Marquez writes a sentence that captures the universal anxiety of women across centuries. In Fermina's heart, the age of 21 was the secret deadline for her surrender to fate. She panicked, terrified of losing this fleeting opportunity. And so, in a rush of anxiety, she decided to marry Dr. Urbino. Surrender to fate. How many marriages are built on this surrender? How many people walk down the aisle not towards a person, but away from a fear? The fear of loneliness. The fear of being left over. The fear of financial instability. Fermina didn't choose a husband. She chose an insurance policy against social irrelevance. And what about the doctor? Did he love her? Or was he, too, making a transaction? Marquez is ruthless in his analysis. The doctor knew he did not love her. He married her because he liked her haughtiness, her seriousness, her strength, and because of a little bit of his own vanity. Dr. Urbino was shopping. He wasn't looking for a soulmate. He was looking for a centerpiece for his life. He needed a wife who could manage his mansion, host his parties, and look elegant on his arm. Fermina was high-quality stock. She was the perfect accessory to his ambition. So the deal was struck, a merger of assets and anxieties. Fermina traded her freedom for security from spinsterhood. Urbino traded his bachelorhood for a perfect social image. They both knew, on the day of their wedding, that the holy grail of love was missing. But they were sophisticated people. They told themselves that love was a primitive emotion, something for poets and peasants. Urbino even had a famous theory, a slogan he would repeat throughout his life. Love is not the prerequisite for marriage, it is the result of it. He believed love could be invented. Not discovered, but engineered. Like a bridge or a vaccination protocol. If the conditions are right, if the materials are high quality, you can build love. And from a cynical, pragmatic perspective, they were right. They built a fortress. They had children. They accumulated wealth. They were the envy of the Caribbean. But there is a silence in their marriage, a deafening silence. During their months-long honeymoon across Europe, they talked about everything. They talked about art, about politics, about the weather, about dinner. But they never spoke of love. Not once, because to speak of it would be to admit it wasn't there. As long as they didn't say the word, they could pretend the void didn't exist. Fermina thought she was entering a safe harbor to escape the storms of life. She didn't realize that a harbor, once the gates are closed, is indistinguishable from a prison. Chapter 3. When marriage becomes a cage, the woman who was eaten alive, the wedding was the event of the century. The President of the Republic himself walked Fermina down the aisle, bestowing the ultimate seal of approval on this dynastic union. The church bells rang so loud they startled the pigeons 3 towns over. It was a spectacle of wealth, power, and promise. They called it a match made in heaven. But the moment the honeymoon ended and the suitcases were unpacked, Fermina realized she hadn't walked into heaven. She had walked into a trap baited with gold, but a trap nonetheless. Its name was the Urbino family tradition. Fermina found herself living under the tyranny of the doctor's mother, Dona Blanca, a woman who was the breathing embodiment of the old guard, a matriarch who believed a daughter-in-law was essentially high-functioning livestock. Dona Blanca's rules were simple and suffocating. Fermina's job was to be a mannequin. She was to display the family jewels, manage the servants, and smile silently at dinners. Did she have her own thoughts? Irrelevant. Did she want a life outside these walls? Preposterous. Dona Blanca would look at her with cold, dead eyes and say, "A woman of the Urbino house does not wander the streets like a stray cat." But the true horror wasn't the boredom. It was the erasure of her motherhood. Fermina gave birth to a son and a daughter. But from the moment the cords were cut, the children were annexed by the state of Dona Blanca. The grandmother hired the nannies. The grandmother chose the schools. The grandmother decided which prayers they would say and what clothes they would wear. Fermina watched, helpless, as her own children grew up looking at the stern old woman as the matriarch, and at their own mother as merely the vessel that had delivered them. At this moment, the realization hit Fermina like a physical blow. She hadn't married a man. She had married a system. And in this system, she was not a partner. She was a legal prisoner. Surely, her husband, the enlightened European-educated doctor, would defend her? Surely, the man who claimed to value her strength would stand up to his mother? No. Every time Fermina tried to rebel, every time she whispered her suffocation to him in the dark, Dr. Urbino would retreat. He would side with his mother. She only wants what is best for the family, my dear. Be patient. It is just her way. Marquez provides the doctor with a terrifyingly brilliant excuse for his cowardice. The doctor invented grand theories to justify his weakness. He refused to admit the misery came from the oppressive atmosphere of his home. Instead, he blamed the institution of marriage itself. He claimed marriage was an absurd invention that only existed through the infinite mercy of God. Listen to the audacity of that logic. He argued, after all, marriage forces 2 strangers, people with no blood relation, often with nothing in common, to sleep in the same bed forever. Scientifically, it is doomed to fail. It sounds philosophical, doesn't it? It sounds intellectual. But strip away the fancy words, and what do you see? It is a cop-out. By blaming God's invention or scientific impossibility, the doctor absolved himself of the responsibility to fix his own home. He could continue being the perfect, obedient son, while his wife slowly withered away in the corner. As the years ground on, Fermina's sharp edges were sanded down. She learned the most essential skill of a long-term aristocratic marriage. Marquez writes, "The key to marital happiness is not love. It is learning to control your disgust." Control your disgust. That phrase chills the blood more than any horror story. But worse than the disgust was the loss of self. Fermina looked in the mirror one day and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Fermina never became the woman she dreamed of being. Instead, she became something she dared not admit to herself: a deluxe servant, a servant draped in silk. Her life became a permanent sentence of 3 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, dinner. The doctor was a tyrant at the table. If the eggplant was too oily, if the meat was slightly tough, he wouldn't just complain. He would push the plate away, eyes filling with tragic tears, and declare, this meal was not made with love. 3 times a day, her worth as a human being was judged by the texture of a vegetable. And the doctor, in his charming, oblivious way, would joke to his friends at the club, "A man needs 2 wives, one for love and one to sew on his buttons." To him, Fermina was a utility. She was the Wi-Fi router of the 19th century essential for the house to function, but invisible until she stopped working. There is a detail in the book that is both hilarious and heartbreaking. The doctor was a perfect husband, but he never picked up a single thing from the floor, and he never turned off a light. If he found a button missing from his shirt, he acted as if the foundations of civilization had collapsed. Can you imagine the psychological toll? Living with a man who believes he is saving the world, but who cannot operate a light switch. Fermina felt her life wasn't her own. Marquez writes, "Fermina always felt that her life was rented from her husband. Rented. You live in the house, but you don't own the walls. You raise the children, but they carry his name. You serve the man, but he sees you as furniture." She became like the royal parrot in the mango tree. Expensive, capable of mimicking speech, ornamental, and caged. She was useful. She was envied. But she had ceased to be a person. Chapter 4. When the soap runs out, the war of attrition. If the story stayed on the oppressive mother-in-law, it would be a tragedy. But life is rarely a clean tragedy. It is often a farce. Just as the couple settled into their golden years, thinking they had survived the worst, Fermina discovered a secret. The saintly Dr. Urbino, the man of unshakable morals, had cheated. Her name was Barbara Lynch. She was 27. She was black, tall, elegant, and possessed a theology degree. She was everything Fermina wasn't: exotic, intellectual, forbiddens. She was a patient of the doctor, and she radiated a raw, feral energy that the sterile Urbino mansion had never known. Fermina didn't find a lipstick stain. She didn't read a text message. She smelled it. Marquez tells us Fermina had the nose of a bloodhound. She smelled a scent on her husband's linen suit, a scent that did not belong to their sanitized life. It was the smell of another woman's sweat and desire. Her world collapsed. 50 years of sacrifice. 50 years of biting her tongue. And for what? So he could humiliate her in his twilight years? If you were Fermina, what would you do? Divorce? In that Catholic, conservative society, divorce was social suicide. It was an admission that your entire life had been a failure. So Fermina chose the path of maximum pain, confrontation, followed by a cold war that would freeze hell over. When she confronted him, the great doctor crumbled. He didn't defend his love. He didn't claim he had found his soulmate. He wept. He confessed like a naughty schoolboy caught stealing candy. Why didn't he leave Fermina for Barbara? Was it because he loved Fermina more? No. Marquez gives us the brutal truth again. He did not fall into the abyss of passion because, due to his cowardice, he refused to exchange his comfort for a life of turmoil. He didn't stay out of loyalty. He stayed because he liked his house. He liked his reputation. He liked having his buttons sewn on. He was too lazy, too comfortable, and too cowardly to blow up his life for passion. The affair lasted only 4 months. A blip in time. But the aftermath was a purgatory that lasted 2 years. They lived together, but apart. They slept in separate rooms. The house became a battlefield where silence was the weapon. But here is the irony. The affair was dramatic, yes, but it wasn't the thing that almost destroyed them. The true enemy of their marriage wasn't Barbara Lynch. It was a bar of soap. Years before the affair, there was the soap war. It sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But it is the most realistic depiction of marriage ever written. One day, the doctor stepped out of the shower and complained, "For a week now, there has been no soap in the bathroom." Fermina, stung by the accusation of domestic incompetence, snapped back, "There has been soap every single day. You just didn't look." The doctor, a man of science, a man who valued empirical truth above all, could not abide this lie. Fermina, a woman who had lost control over everything else in her life, could not abide this criticism. It escalated. The doctor moved into the dressing room to sleep. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. He refused to return to the marital bed until she admitted there was no soap. She refused to let him back in until he admitted he was a blind, nagging tyrant. It wasn't about the soap anymore. It was a power struggle. It was 2 egos, compressed into a small space, fighting for air. Marquez writes, "Both were amazed, for they had painfully proven that in so many years of conjugal struggle, all they had done was cultivate hatred." At the peak of the madness, the doctor shouted, "If necessary, we will go to the archbishop. We will make a public confession and let God decide if there was soap or not." Fermina screamed back, "To hell with the archbishop." She threatened to pack her bags and move back to her father's decaying house. That terrified the doctor. He realized she wasn't bluffing. The structure of his life was about to collapse over a toiletry item. So he surrendered. But look at how he surrendered. One night, Fermina found him asleep in the dressing room. She shook him awake and said coldly, "Go to sleep in your bed." He looked at her, groggy, missing the comfort of his mattress. And he said the line that should be carved on the tombstone of every long marriage. "All right, let me stay. There was soap." He lied. Even in surrender, he had to claim victory over reality. I am the bigger man for lying to appease you. This is the dark comedy of their union. When they were old, they looked back on the soap war with disbelief. They realized it had brought them closer to divorce than the infidelity ever did. Why? Because infidelity is a moral crisis. You can navigate it with grand gestures of forgiveness or penance. But the soap? That is the grind of daily life. That is the sand in your shoe. You can survive a hurricane, but you can be driven mad by a dripping faucet. Perhaps that is the secret to a 50-year marriage. It isn't about deep, romantic love. It is about endurance. It is about mastering the art of controlling your disgust. As Marquez concludes, they were like 2 old war veterans. They had overcome the trap of passion, the mockery of illusion. They had gone beyond love, for they had lived together long enough to realize that love was always love, any time and any place, but it became more solid the closer it got to death. They had finally reached a truce. They had forged a bond stronger than steel, made of habit and shared scars. And just as they settled into this peaceful, sexless, comfortable twilight, death knocked on the door. Chapter 5. When passion is a paper tiger, the folly of 80 years, before we reach the end, We must look closer at that affair, the doctor's grand passion with Barbara Lynch, because it reveals a cruel truth. Passion, in the face of aging and habit, is incredibly fragile. Dr. Urbino was nearly 80 when he strayed. 80. He had spent a lifetime building a monument to his own virtue, and he torched it for a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. Was it true love? Was it a meeting of souls? Let's look at the text. It's brutal. The doctor was anxious. He felt like a teenager, terrified and eager. But the act itself? They had to meet in secret. It was hurried. It was clumsy. The doctor wasn't thinking about her pleasure, or even his own. He was thinking about the time. He was checking his watch. He was performing the biological ritual of sex, just to prove he was still alive. This wasn't romance. It was a vampire feeding on youth, to ward off the fear of the grave. And the moment it was over, the shame washed over him. He wanted to die. He promised himself never again. But the next day, he was back in her bed. How did it end? Did he bravely choose his wife? Did he heroically sacrifice his happiness for duty? No, he was caught. And when Fermina left him, when she packed her bags and went to her cousin as estate for 2 years, the doctor discovered the true hierarchy of his needs. He thought he was madly in love with Barbara. But when Fermina was gone, he didn't run to Barbara. He realized he couldn't function. He couldn't find his socks. He didn't know what to eat. He didn't know how to exist in his own home. The passion for Barbara evaporated instantly, replaced by the terrifying, practical void left by his wife. 2 years later, broken by his own incompetence and loneliness, he went to the estate and begged Fermina to come back. He didn't ask for forgiveness for breaking her heart. He asked her to come back because he was a lost child without his mother. He never saw Barbara Lynch again. And years later, with breathtaking audacity, he would say, "Those 2 years of suffering were not my fault. It was because my wife has a bad habit of smelling my clothes. It is a vice." There it is, the narcissism of the comfortable man. When the adrenaline of the affair fades, what remains is not a tragic love story. What remains is a man who just wants his laundry done and his dinner served. In the end, a man will not leave his wife for a lover. He will not leave the woman who knows where his medicine is kept for the woman who makes his heart race. Heart rates are dangerous at 80. Comfort is the only God left. Chapter 6. The Fall from Grace. The Man, the Parrot, and the Mirror of the Future. It brings us back to where we started. That fateful Sunday, Pentecost. The morning had been marked by the suicide of Jeremiah, the photographer who refused to grow old. That death had rattled the doctor. It was a memento mori, a reminder that death was not a theoretical concept discussed in medical journals, but a physical reality waiting in the shadows. Dr. Urbino returned home, shaken, but still Dr. Urbino. He was still the master of his domain. He was still the protagonist of the city's history, until the parrot decided otherwise. This was no ordinary bird. It was a royal parrot, a creature of vibrant plumage and wicked intelligence. It spoke French. It could recite parts of the Latin Mass. It had been the doctor's pride and joy, a symbol of his cultured home. But that afternoon, the parrot flew to the highest branch of the mango tree and refused to come down. The servants tried to coax it. No luck. The fire department could have been called. They would have come instantly for the great doctor. But Dr. Juvenal Urbino, 81 years old, a man who had just stared into the face of a suicide and felt the chill of mortality, made a decision. Perhaps it was hubris. Perhaps he wanted to prove he was still capable, still strong, still the man who could conquer nature. He fetched the ladder. He climbed. Rung by shaky rung, he reached the top. The leaves rustled. The air smelled of ripe mangoes and impending rain. He reached out. His hand closed around the bird. He had done it. triumph, and then ... he slipped. Marquez describes the moment with cruel brevity. He felt a tear of terror, but it was fleeting. There was no cinematic struggle, no final speech to the heavens, just gravity. The most distinguished man in the city, the hero of public health, fell from a tree like a clumsy child chasing a toy. Death is the great equalizer. It does not care about your medals, your lineage, or your dignity. It stripped him of his grandeur in a split second. He landed in the dirt. His spine was shattered. His life was leaking out into the wet earth. Through the haze of pain, he saw her. Fermina Daza. She had heard the commotion and come running. She stood over him, her face a mask of horror. And in those final seconds, as the lights of the world dimmed, Dr. Urbino did something extraordinary. He didn't ask for a priest. He didn't ask for his children. He didn't repent for his sins. He looked at the woman he had tormented, bored, ignored, and betrayed for 50 years. He looked at the woman who had been his prisoner and his warden. Tears streamed down his face, tears not of pain, but of a sudden, overwhelming clarity. He gasped his final words. "Only God knows how much I loved you." And then he was gone. Those words land like a grenade. Only God knows ... Why only God? Because he had never shown it. Not really. He had shown her duty. He had shown her stability. He had shown her a perfect marriage. But he had buried the love under layers of narcissism, control, and social performance. Only in the absolute finality of death did the truth break through the concrete of his ego. So the king is dead. How does the queen react? Fermina did not wail. She did not throw herself on the coffin. Instead, she enacted a ritual of purification. She went to the bedroom. She gathered his clothes, the suits he was so vain about, the shirts she had to inspect for missing buttons. She took them to the fireplace. She lit a match. As the flames consumed the fabric, curling the collars and blackening the cuffs, Fermina wasn't just burning clothes. She was burning the evidence. She was burning the memory of the perfect husband. She was burning the rules. She was burning the 50 years of submission. She sat there, watching the fire, inhaling the smoke of burning wool and linen, and she smiled. "Now," she said, the realization blooming in her chest like a dark flower, "now, this house finally belongs to me." It was a moment of terrifying liberation. The master was gone. The servant was free. She was 72 years old. She was a widow. And for the first time since she was 21, she took a breath that was entirely her own. But the universe has a twisted sense of humor. Fermina thought she was closing the book on her life as a woman. She thought she was settling into the quiet, sexless dignity of widowhood. She was wrong. Because someone else had been waiting for this moment. Someone had been watching the clock, not for minutes, but for decades. Epilogue, the checkmate of rationality. We have arrived at the end of the doctor's story, but we are standing on the precipice of another. Let's go back to that question I asked you at the start. Does marrying the right person, the safe person, the rational choice, lead to happiness? Dr. Urbino and Fermina Daza gave us an answer spanning 53 years, 7 months, and 11 days. And the answer is complex. Yes, you can cultivate affection. You can build a partnership that survives wars, plagues, and infidelity. But do not mistake survival for life. Fermina gained security. She avoided the stigma of the spinster. She lived in luxury. But the cost was her soul. She had to amputate her own personality to fit into the box Dr. Urbino built for her. She lived by the doctor's motto: the most important thing in a good marriage is not happiness, but stability. It is the ultimate rational argument. It is risk management applied to the human heart, and it works until it doesn't. Fermina burning those clothes in the fireplace is the verdict. It is a 72-year-old woman telling her 21-year-old self, "I survived. I was safe, but I was never free. And now I have to find out who I am before I die. She proved that marriage can be a sanctuary, yes, but it can also be a tomb where you are buried alive, suffocated by comfort. True freedom, it seems, demands a price that most of us are too afraid to pay. It demands solitude. It demands the death of your illusions. But the story doesn't end in the ashes. Because just as the funeral guests were leaving, just as the flowers on the grave were still fresh, a ghost appeared at Fermina's door. Florentino Ariza, the poor poet she rejected 50 years ago. He stood there, hat in hand, looking at the newly widowed Fermina. He looked at the wrinkles, the gray hair, the grief, and he delivered the line he had been rehearsing for half a century. I have waited for this opportunity for more than half a century, to repeat to you once again my vow of eternal fidelity and everlasting love. This leaves Fermina and you, and me with the final, impossible question. At 21, she chose reason, the doctor, to escape fear. It became a prison. At 72, she is finally free. Does she have the courage to choose madness, the poet? When you have finally reclaimed your life from one man, are you willing to hand it over to another? Or is solitude the only true lover a woman can trust? Is it ever too late to choose passion? Or is passion just another trap, another cage with different bars? We will explore the answer in the next episode. We will see what happens when love tries to bloom not in the spring of youth, but in the winter of decay. If you want to know Fermina's answer, if you want to see if a 70-year-old heart can still break or sore hit that like button, the more likes we get, the faster we decode the next chapter. Because this story deserves to be witnessed. I am Fanko. See you in the next one.